You grow up with nothing. You expect nothing. When a deadbeat grandfather leaves you a rusting shipping container on the docks, you assume it's a final insult. You definitely don't expect a grinder, a crowbar, and $20 million in cold, hard secrets waiting in the dark. The lawyer's office smelled like stale coffee and floor wax. It was the kind of room designed to make you feel small, with its heavy oak desk and shelves of identical, unread legal volumes. Hayes sat in a chair that squeaked every time he shifted his weight. He kept his eyes on the cracked leather of his work boots. Across the desk, Giles pushed a thin manila folder across the blotter. There was no leather-bound ledger, no trust fund documents, just 3 sheets of paper held together by a rusty staple. "That's it?" Hayes asked. His voice was flat. He didn't feel grief. He just felt the familiar, dull ache of wasted time. "That's the entirety of Walter's estate," Giles said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't look at Hayes. He looked at the paperwork, likely calculating how quickly he could bill for this 15-minute appointment. "Your grandfather wasn't a man of means, Mr. Miller. He lived in a rented trailer in Nevada for the last 20 years. No savings, no assets of note." "Except the box," Hayes said. "Yes, except the box." Giles tapped the top page. A 40-foot standard shipping container, currently sitting in a leased lot at the Port of Baltimore. The lease on the concrete pad was paid up 10 years in advance. That term ends next Tuesday. After that, the Port Authority will begin charging you $500 a month for storage, or they will auction the contents to cover the fees. Hayes let out a short, hollow breath. Typical Walt. The old man had dropped Hayes at a state-run group home when he was 7, claiming he needed a few weeks to get his feet under him. 21 years later, Walt finally reached out from the grave, and all he had to offer was a storage bill. "I don't want it," Hayes said. He stood up, the chair groaning in protest. "Let them auction it. Let them dump it in the bay for all I care." Giles sighed, finally looking up. "I understand your frustration, but I legally advise you to at least inspect the contents. If there are hazardous materials inside, chemicals, old oil, asbestos, the port can come after you as the legal heir for disposal fees. It could ruin your credit. Just go look at it, Hayes. Put a padlock on it or sign it over to a scrap company." Hayes worked HVAC in the commercial district. His credit was the only thing keeping him in a 1-bedroom apartment instead of his truck. He clenched his jaw, the muscles feathering along his cheek. He snatched the paperwork off the desk. 2 hours later, Hayes was driving his beat-up Ford down the industrial arteries of the port. The air here was heavy, thick with the smell of diesel exhaust, salt brine, and dead fish. Massive gantry cranes loomed against the overcast sky, like mechanical dinosaurs picking at the bones of the city. He found Lot 42 nestled in the shadow of a towering stack of Maersk containers. It was a miserable strip of cracked asphalt backed up against a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, and sitting in the center of it was Walt's legacy. It was a corrugated steel box, painted a faded, sickly orange. The sides were streaked with rust that bled down the metal like dried wounds. The registration numbers, DSCU 993420, were barely legible under layers of grime and seagull droppings. Frank, a port manager with a clipboard and a high-vis vest stretched tight over a massive gut, met him at the lot. "You the Miller kid?" Frank asked, chewing on an unlit cigar. "I'm Hayes, yeah. Your old man hasn't been out here in a decade. Padlock's probably fused shut. You got tools?" Hayes went to the bed of his truck and grabbed a battery-powered angle grinder and a pair of heavy leather gloves. He walked up to the towering steel doors. The locking mechanism was a heavy steel bar secured by a solid brass master lock. The brass had oxidized into a chalky green crust. Hayes didn't hesitate. He flipped the switch on the grinder. The blade screamed as it bit into the hardened steel shackle. Sparks showered over his boots, bright and violent against the gray afternoon. It took 2 minutes of grinding, the motor whining in protest, before the steel snapped with a sharp crack. Hayes yanked the hot lock free and tossed it onto the asphalt. Careful opening it, Frank grunted, taking a step back. Sometimes things shift in transit. You open those doors and a refrigerator falls on your head. Hayes gripped the rusted locking bars. He braced his boots against the asphalt and pulled. The hinges screamed, a high, metallic shriek that echoed across the empty lot. He threw his shoulder into the door, forcing it open against years of neglect. The heavy steel door swung wide. Hayes stepped back, waving away a cloud of stale, suffocating dust that rolled out of the dark interior. The smell hit him instantly: mildew, rotting cardboard, rat urine. He pulled a heavy flashlight from his belt and clicked it on, sweeping the beam into the cavernous 40-foot space. It was garbage. Floor to ceiling, front to back. It was packed with absolute junk. Moldy cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly, a rusted lawnmower, stacks of yellowed newspapers tied with brittle twine, a broken washing machine, tangled webs of old extension cords, PVC pipes, and cracked plastic buckets. Hayes stood there, the flashlight beam trembling slightly in his hand. He didn't know what he had expected: a secret stash of money, a letter explaining why Walt never came back, a single, meaningful heirloom. Instead, he got a hoarder's nest, a 40-foot monument to a broken man's obsession with trash. Frank chuckled, a wet, phlegmy sound. "Well, looks like you got yourself a lot of trips to the county dump, kid. Better get started. Tuesday comes fast." Hayes walked over to a stack of dry, rotted tires near the entrance. He sat down on them, resting his forearms on his knees. The diesel engines rumbled in the distance. The seagulls cried overhead. Hayes dropped his head into his hands and laughed. It was a bitter, jagged sound that scraped against his throat. Walt had screwed him one last time. The next morning, Hayes arrived at Lot 42 before the sun had burned off the harbor fog. He drove a rented 20-foot box truck, the daily rate already eating into his meager savings. He had called 4 different junk removal companies. The cheapest quote to clear a 40-foot container of loose trash was $2,000, money he didn't have. He was going to have to do it himself. He tied a bandana over his nose and mouth, pulled on heavy leather gloves, and waded into the mess. The physical labor was brutal. The container was a steel oven. By noon, the overcast sky had cleared, and the sun beat down on the corrugated roof, turning the inside of the box into a sweltering, stagnant sauna. Sweat stung Hayes's eyes and soaked through his gray t-shirt. He threw out boxes of moldy National Geographics. He dragged out the rusted lawnmower. He hauled out bags of clothes that disintegrated into dust and moth wings the second he grabbed them. Every item he threw into the back of the rental truck felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. It was the sheer pointlessness of it all. Why rent a shipping container in Baltimore just to store broken lamps and rusted car parts? Why lock it up like a fortress? By 3 p.m, his arms were shaking from exhaustion. He had cleared the front 20 feet of the container. He stopped to drink from a plastic gallon jug of water, leaning against the hot steel wall, trying to catch his breath. He clicked on his flashlight and aimed it toward the back half of the box. The trash didn't go all the way back. About 25 feet in, the piles of cardboard and rusted junk stopped abruptly. Behind them was a wall. Hayes frowned. He walked deeper into the container, his boots crunching over broken glass and dried rat droppings. He reached the back of the trash pile and cleared away a stack of broken wooden pallets. It wasn't the back wall of the shipping container. It was a false bulkhead. Someone had welded heavy steel plates across the width of the container, effectively sealing off the last 15 feet. The welds were sloppy, done by an amateur, covered in a thick layer of gray primer. Hayes pressed his gloved hand against the cold steel. It felt different. The air here felt different. The smell of rat urine and mold faded, replaced by something faint but distinct. Motor oil, polished wood, and heavy industrial cosmoline. His heart performed a strange, uneven rhythm against his ribs. He ran his flashlight along the edges of the steel plate. At the bottom, near the wooden floorboards of the container, there was a heavy steel latch, secured by a modern, high-grade Meatco padlock. This wasn't a hoarder's pile, the junk in the front, the broken mowers, the moldy clothes. It was camouflage. It was insulation, a visual deterrent for anyone who managed to crack the front doors. Hayes practically ran back to the truck. He grabbed a heavy crowbar and his angle grinder. When he returned to the false wall, he didn't bother with finesse. He slapped a fresh battery into the grinder and laid the spinning blade directly into the heavy hasp of the Medeco lock. Sparks ricocheted off the steel walls, illuminating the dark container in violent flashes of white and orange. The hasp cut through. Hayes jammed the crowbar behind the steel plate and threw his entire body weight backward. The metal groaned. The welds popped one by one, sounding like small gunshots in the enclosed space. With a final, agonizing screech of tearing metal, the heavy steel door swung outward, crashing heavily against the side of the container. Hayes stood in the threshold, chest heaving, the grinder still smoking in his hand. He shined the flashlight into the hidden chamber. The light hit a heavy canvas tarp, thick with dust. But beneath the tarp was a shape. Low, sweeping, and unmistakably aerodynamic. Hayes stepped inside. The air was cool in here, insulated by the false wall and whatever was stacked behind it. He reached out and grabbed the corner of the heavy canvas. It was stiff, resistant. He pulled hard. Dust plumed into the air, sparkling in the beam of his flashlight. The canvas slid away, pooling on the wooden floor. Hayes stopped breathing. Gleaming in the harsh white light of his torch was the massive, sweeping front fender of a car. But not just a car. The metal was a flawless, deep midnight blue, polished to a mirror finish. The headlights were massive wire mesh discs. A long, louvered hood stretched forward, ending in a towering chrome radiator grille that bore a silver ornament, an elephant rearing up on its hind legs. Hayes knew enough about cars to know he was looking at something impossible. A Bugatti, a pre-war Bugatti. He walked slowly around the front of the vehicle, pulling the tarp back further. The car was pristine. It didn't belong in a rusting shipping container in Baltimore. It belonged on the lawn at Pebble Beach, or under glass in a museum. It was a Bugatti Type 41 Royale, or something incredibly close to it. The leather of the interior looked untouched, treated with heavy balms to keep it from cracking over the decades. But it wasn't just the car. Stacked securely against the far wall of the container, behind the sweeping tail of the Bugatti, were 4 massive wooden crates. They were bound in heavy iron straps. Hayes stepped past the car, his hand trailing lightly over the cold, flawless chrome of the bumper. He approached the crates. Stenciled on the side of the raw pine wood, faded but clearly legible, were black letters, German text, and beneath that, the unmistakable crest of a Zurich banking house. Hayes set his flashlight down on the hood of the car, letting it illuminate the crates. He wedged the flat end of the crowbar under the lid of the nearest box and pushed down. The old iron straps groaned, resisting for a moment before the rusted nails gave way. He pried the wooden lid back. Inside, swaddled in layers of oiled canvas and heavy straw, were neat, stacked rows of rectangular objects. Hayes reached in. His fingers brushed against something cold, incredibly heavy and smooth. He pulled it out, bringing it into the beam of the flashlight. It was a brick, a heavy, dull yellow brick, stamped with a serial number and a fineness purity rating of 999.9, solid gold. Hayes dropped to his knees, the gold bar heavy in his hands. His mind spun, trying to reconcile the deadbeat old man who had abandoned him at a group home with the fortune sitting in front of him. Walt hadn't been broke. Walt had been hiding and looking at the pristine hypercar and the crates of unmarked, untraceable gold. Hayes realized something else. You don't hide something like this unless someone terrifying is looking for it. Hayes did not sleep that night. He sat at the small formica table in his kitchen, the gold bar sitting on a grease-stained paper towel next to a cold cup of diner coffee. The brick weighed exactly 12.4 kilos, 27 pounds. In the harsh fluorescent light of his apartment, it didn't look romantic or magical. It looked heavy. It looked like a tombstone. He had spent 4 hours on his laptop, using a VPN and the Tor browser, searching the serial numbers stamped into the gold, cross-referencing the Bugatti chassis details he had memorized. The results terrified him. The car was a ghost. Automotive historians claimed only 6 Bugatti Type 41 Royales were ever built. But rumors had circulated since 1939 of a 7th chassis commissioned by a French industrialist and hidden away before the German occupation. It vanished completely after the war, value incalculable, upwards of 40 million at a private auction. The gold was worse. The serial numbers matched a known ledger of bullion, stolen from the Swiss National Depository in the late 70s. A heist orchestrated by an Irish paramilitary splinter group financed by a rogue American logistics contractor. Walt, his grandfather, hadn't been a hapless drifter. He had been a ghost, moving contraband across borders until the heat got too high. Walt had parked the container in Baltimore, walked away, and spent the rest of his life in a Nevada trailer park, terrified of his own shadow. He left Hayes at the group home not out of spite, but out of necessity. To sever the tie. To make sure the people looking for the Zurich gold never looked twice at a foster kid in a state-run facility. A heavy knock at the door broke the silence. Hayes flinched. The clock on the microwave read 4:15 a.m. He stood up slowly, grabbing a heavy steel wrench from his toolbox on the counter. He crept to the door and peered through the scratched peephole. Standing in the hallway was an older man in a tailored charcoal topcoat. He held a leather briefcase. Behind him stood 2 younger men in dark windbreakers, their postures stiff, eyes scanning the narrow, dimly lit corridor. Hayes felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his spine. Frank from the port. The overweight manager had seen him break the lock. Frank knew Hayes was clearing the unit. Frank had made a phone call. "Mr. Miller," the older man said, his voice muffled through the cheap wood of the door. "My name is Sterling. I represent certain interests who have been looking for your grandfather's property for a very long time. We know what you found. Open the door. We prefer to do this politely." Hayes backed away. He lived on the fire escape side of the building. His apartment was a second-floor walk-up. He didn't grab clothes. He didn't grab his phone. He grabbed a heavy canvas duffel bag, shoved the single gold bar inside, and threw it over his shoulder. "Mr. Miller." The voice was sharper now. The handle rattled. A heavy shoulder slammed against the wood, the door frame splintering slightly with a sharp, cracking sound. Hayes moved. He threw the deadbolt on the kitchen window, shoved the glass up, and vaulted out onto the rusted iron fire escape. The metal grated under his boots. He scrambled down the steps, the heavy duffel swinging wildly against his ribs. He heard the front door of his apartment give way with a deafening crash, just as his boots hit the damp alley pavement. He sprinted toward the main street. He didn't run toward his truck. They would be watching it. He ran toward the subway entrance 2 blocks down, blending into the early morning shadows and the scattered night shift workers heading home. He rode the train for 3 hours, transferring blindly between lines, watching the doors at every stop. The duffel bag dug into his shoulder, a constant bruising reminder of the reality he was now trapped in. Walt had left him a fortune, but he had also left him the crosshairs. By 9 in the morning, Hayes was sitting in a diner in South Baltimore, nursing a black coffee. He needed a plan. The men in his apartment, Sterling's people, wanted the gold. They wanted the car. They would monitor the port. They would wait for him to go back and claim it, or they would simply go to Lot 42 and take it themselves. But they didn't have the key, and they didn't know the Port Authority's bureaucracy like Hayes did. Hayes walked to a payphone by the diner's restrooms. He dropped a quarter in and dialed the Port Administration office. He asked for Frank. "Yeah?" Frank grunted through the receiver. "It's Hayes Miller." A brief silence. Hey, kid, you coming back today? Got a lot of trash left to move. No, Hayes said, keeping his voice dead flat. I'm done. I'm signing it over. Signing it over? Frank sounded entirely too eager. You sure? The old man left me a box of literal garbage, Frank. The smell alone made me sick. I don't have the time or the money to haul out 100 broken lawnmowers. You said I could sign it over to a scrap company? Yeah, absolutely. Frank's chair squeaked over the line. I got a buddy with a disposal crew. I can fax you the release forms. You sign 'em, the contents belong to the yard, and you walk away clean. No disposal fees. Fax it to the library on 4th Street, Hayes said. I'll sign it. But listen, Frank, I left my angle grinder and my crowbar just inside the doors. Tell your buddy to leave them by the guard shack for me. Sure thing, kid. Smart move. Hayes hung up. He knew exactly what Frank would do. Frank had tipped off Sterling's crew, probably for a finder's fee. Now Frank would tell them the kid walked away, thinking it was just trash. They would move in tonight to claim the prize. But Hayes wasn't walking away. He was an HVAC technician. He spent his life moving massive, heavy, highly visible objects through tight spaces under impossible deadlines. He just needed a bigger truck. The rain started at dusk, a cold, driving downpour that turned the Baltimore port into a miserable expanse of slick asphalt and blinding sodium lights. Hayes sat in the cab of a rented flatbed tow truck, parked 2 blocks outside the port's perimeter fence. He wore a dark raincoat and a generic baseball cap pulled low. He was operating purely on adrenaline and the 27 pounds of gold sitting on the passenger seat. He watched the main gate. At 11 p.m., a black Lincoln Navigator rolled up to the guard shack. Frank leaned out of the booth, grinning, and waved the SUV through. No paperwork, no inspection. Sterling's crew had arrived. Hayes put the tow truck in gear. He didn't drive toward the main gate. He drove to the commercial access road on the eastern perimeter, a stretch of fence he knew was poorly monitored. He cut the headlights. He pulled a pair of heavy bolt cutters from the floorboard. It took him 5 minutes to cut the lock on the maintenance gate and swing it open. He drove the flatbed through, navigating by the dim, ambient light of the cargo cranes. He parked 3 lots away from Lot 42, hidden behind a towering stack of empty Maersk containers. He grabbed a heavy pry bar and a roll of industrial shrink wrap, slipping out into the rain. He moved silently between the steel canyons. As he approached Lot 42, he heard voices. 3 men stood in the rain outside Walt's container. The heavy doors were wide open. A portable floodlight illuminated the interior. Sterling stood under an umbrella directing 2 men in windbreakers who were furiously tossing moldy boxes and rusted car parts out onto the asphalt. "Keep digging," Sterling snapped, his voice carrying over the sound of the rain. The manager said he broke a false wall in the back. "Clear this trash." Puff. Hayes watched from the shadows. They were distracted. They were focused entirely on the back of the container. He didn't need to fight them. He just needed to trap them. Hayes crept toward the heavy steel doors. The men were 20 feet inside, hauling out a heavy, waterlogged mattress. The sound of the rain masking his footsteps, Hayes grabbed the edge of the right door. He pulled. The rusted hinges screamed. The men inside froze, dropping the mattress. Sterling spun around, dropping his umbrella, his hand diving into his tailored coat. But Hayes already had the momentum. He slammed the right door shut, then grabbed the left, throwing his entire body weight into it. The doors met with a deafening metallic boom that echoed across the empty lot. "Hey!" one of the men yelled from inside. A heavy thud shook the steel doors as someone slammed into them. Hayes ignored them. He grabbed the heavy steel locking bars and jammed them into place, securing the latches. He pulled a thick, hardened steel master lock from his pocket, the one he had bought that afternoon, and snapped it through the hasp. The men inside started pounding on the corrugated steel, their voices muffled and frantic. A single gunshot rang out, the bullet denting the thick steel door from the inside but failing to penetrate. "Enjoy the Bugatti," Hayes muttered, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. He ran. He sprinted back to the flatbed, his boots splashing through deep puddles of oily water. He climbed into the cab, fired the engine, and threw it into drive. He didn't bother with the headlights until he was back through the maintenance gate, tearing down the access road toward the interstate. He drove for 6 hours, heading south, deep into the Virginia mountains. He pulled into a gravel turnout overlooking a foggy valley, just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon. He cut the engine. The heater ticked as it cooled down. Hayes reached over and unzipped the duffel bag. He pulled out the gold brick. It was cold, unforgiving. He thought about the men trapped in the shipping container. The Port Authority would eventually find them, probably by morning. There would be questions. The police would get involved. The FBI would run the serial numbers on the gold and the chassis number on the car. The whole thing would become a massive federal nightmare. Sterling and his people would be tied up in interrogations for months. The Zurich banking house would try to claim the bullion. The French government would want the car. It was going to be a legal bloodbath. And Hayes was 300 miles away, entirely undocumented. He had signed the release forms at the library. Legally, the container and its contents belonged to Frank's scrapyard buddy. Hayes had no legal tie to the mess left behind. He looked down at the brick in his lap. 12.4 kilos. At current market value, a little over $800,000, it wasn't $20 million. It wasn't a priceless pre-war Bugatti, but it was enough. It was enough to buy a modest piece of land out west. Enough to start his own commercial HVAC business. Enough to never have to worry about rent or a broken-down truck or the crushing weight of scraping by month to month. Walt had tried to leave him everything, and in doing so, had almost gotten him killed. The old man's greed had kept him isolated in a trailer park, terrified of his own wealth. Hayes wasn't going to make the same mistake. He was breaking the cycle. He didn't need a museum piece or a mountain of stolen bullion. He just needed a start. Hayes wrapped the gold back in the canvas. He put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the empty highway, driving into the quiet morning, leaving the rust and the ghosts far behind. Hayes walked away with just one gold bar, leaving a $40 million Bugatti and a mountain of stolen bullion for the feds to sort out. Did he make the smartest move of his life, or the biggest mistake by leaving the rest behind? Let me know what you would do in the comments below. If you enjoyed this crazy story of hidden inheritance, smash that like button, share it with your friends, and make sure to subscribe for more thrilling tales.